Now, some of you, most of you maybe, will be aware that there's funny noises in the room. Also, that I'm involved in a project to develop what will hopefully become a uniform national way of assessing students on clinical placement. Now, in many ways, we've been quite backwards as a profession in doing this. Other health-related professions have national assessments. I think the first was speech pathology, who have COMPASS. And COMPASS is not only used in every Australian university and also in New Zealand for the assessment of speech pathology students, it's also been sold to Singapore, and the universities in Singapore are using it as well. Occupational therapy has one they call the SPEF-R. Where they get that name from, I have no idea. It sort of sounds a bit like being hit over the head, but it's called the SPEF-R. And then there's also physiotherapy. Have recently introduced the APP, the Assessment of Physiotherapy Practice. And radiation therapy have a uniform national assessment tool too. So that one's a bit closer to home for us. So I always say, if they can do it, we can. That's why I said it. So, I mean, honestly, if they can do it in radiation therapy, radiographers can do it, can't we? Okay? So I've been involved in this process of the background behind getting it happen probably for about 3 years we've been working on it. And it looks like there's nothing happening when there's a lot happening behind the scenes to build the background. Last year, you may or may not have seen, we had a national survey which went out, was advertised via the AIR, and the survey was done through SurveyMonkey, and we had 103 responses nationwide to that survey. I'm going to refer to that in the presentation this morning, and we've used the survey in what we're proposing. Now, just as an aside, while I mention the AIR, I would like you all to know that today it does have appellation from the AIR for CPD. We have a number. The only problem is the AIR forgot to send it to us before today.
It's coming on Tuesday.
Yeah, it's coming on Tuesday. So although your certificates don't have the logo on them, we will let you know when we have the appellation number, and you can all lodge credits for today for your CPD. We wanted to make sure that was there for you all. Okay, so let's talk about the things that have been involved in the design. The first thing is what we call the transition table, and you're probably wondering what on earth that is. I will explain. The next thing we need to look at is the alignment of university standards and professional accreditation body standards. The next thing is what we call at Charles Sturt the REA, stands for Radiographic Examination Assessment. In Sydney it's just called competencies. So we've done a review of how that's done. We're going to have a look at some educational literature, and we're going to look at the input from the profession locally, which is the survey I was talking about. So, firstly, the transition table. Now, you'll remember this morning we were talking about standards, okay? Now, ideally, what we want is to have our students measured against standards. I made that quite clear this morning, all right? However, when we're talking about assessing clinical placement, I'm sure many of you have struggled with using exactly the same assessment for every level of the course. How do you rate a first year on the same scale that you're rating a third year on their final placement? Do you make the first year low because they don't have the knowledge when the standard that they're being assessed by is the same as the third year? You getting what I'm saying? We need to have a form of assessment which takes into account the level of training that the student is at. Does that make sense? Is that a good rational basis to build our assessment on? Okay. And look, none of this is new. I'm not claiming to have reinvented the wheel. This has come from, they did it in speech. I've read the thesis of the person who developed the speech pathology compass, and some of you, I mentioned Professor McAllister, who's Natalie's boss, head of the Work Integrated Learning Unit at the University of Sydney. She was involved in the development of Compass and has a huge amount of experience in this type of thing. So this is where the transition table fits in. Now, I don't claim credit for the transition table. This had already been done by my colleagues at Charles Sturt before I even started there. And basically it looks like this. And this has, as the criterion down the side, as I should use the plural, the criteria down the sides, it has general areas of capability. And we're looking at, firstly, a global general description of attainment, a summary if you like. We're looking at practice knowledge, degree of independence, time efficiency, and let me interrupt myself there for a minute. Isn't that one that obviously changes as the student progresses through the course? Okay. We wouldn't expect the first year to be time efficient, would we? It just doesn't make sense. Professional reasoning, task ability, and interpersonal capabilities. Okay? Now, this is giving us different standards for first year, second year, third year, and this also has fourth year, which we'll have our first cohort of fourth year students from Charles Sturt next year in 2014. As you all know, Sydney are starting their 4-year degree in 2014, so by 2017 they'll also have fourth years. So because our fourth years at Charles Sturt have 2 18-week blocks, the transition table has the first block, Year 4, Session 1, and the second one, Year 4, Session 2. Now, when I set about developing this, I looked at it and I thought, this is a good basis for developing our standards-based assessment on, because it's giving us a different standard. Well, I shouldn't say a different standard, a development, a progression of the same standard for each of the criteria as the student progresses through the course. However, we have more than one clinical block in a year. For those of you who aren't familiar with the structure of our 4-year degree at Charles Sturt, at the end of first year they do a 2-week placement, 1 week of which is radiography, 1 of which is nuclear medicine, because we have a common first year. And of course this year it includes radiation therapy as well. And then in second year they do 3 4-week placements, 2A, 2B and 2C. In third year they do 2 4-week placements, 3A and 3B. And then if they pass everything, they move into the residency for fourth year. So we need to expand our transition table. We need to expand it so that the progression is more detailed and so that we have a progression from each clinical block to the next, so that we have clear expectations of the standard that is expected in each of these areas as the student progresses from clinical block to the next. Have I lost anybody yet? Is it making sense? Okay. As I said, please, if there's something you don't like, something you disagree with, say so. We really want to hear your opinion. So, the original transition table is excellent for progression from one year of program to the next. As I've said, we want to use an expanded version for progression from one placement block to the next. We've based this on the original, but extra levels have been inserted to define the expectations and achievement levels for each block. Now let me just say, this is really just a rubric that we talked about this morning, all right? Now at Charles Sturt, we are busy implementing rubrics for every assessment task in every subject. In my role in the Learning and Teaching Committee in the school, one of the things we're going to be doing in the next few weeks is looking at the rubrics that the academics have developed for each subject and making sure they're aligned to the objectives and the standards for each of the subjects. So really, we're bringing clinical into line with the academic units. Making sense so far? Good. So, as I've said to you this morning, it's really easy for a student to wander into your department and you just tick them off based on what you think they should be at that level. But with this, we're telling you what we expect. We're telling you what the profession expects, a student at each level. And we're going to be ranking them according to what's expected at each level. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm doing that deliberately so that, you know, if you're a bit like me, I'm like a computer, you've got to punch the information in. So you've got to make sure that, I want to make sure that you're getting this so that we've got you all on board. As I said, our aim is to make this go national. And if it does, then you people are in the pioneering group who are going to be able to have input into what we're doing. So it's great that you've been able to come. So our expanded transition table looks like this. Now I don't expect you to read all of that now. There is a link to this very document on the ClinTeach website under proposed standards. So when you first log into ClinTeach, you can have a look at this and you can comment on that. Now, let me also say, before I go any further, that we are proposing to do a joint pilot study of this new version of assessment between Charles Sturt and the University of Sydney. Last week I gave this same presentation to the MRS academics at Sydney, and they seem to be in favour of doing the pilot study. And so what we're going to be doing, starting with the 2B placement for Charles Sturt and the Block 2 second year clinical placement from the University of Sydney, is we're going to be asking you to fill out the old assessment form and the new one side by side. And we're going to be doing that for the rest of the year as a pilot study. And we've submitted ethics applications to do this and all the rest of it, so we're trying to keep it above board as much as we can. But the aim of it is to test the reliability and the validity of what we're doing, to see how people like it, to see if they think it's workable and usable. And once we get some figures, some statistics out of it, we can write it up, publish it, and then we're opening the door to other universities jumping on board with the trial. We've already got in principle agreement from every university in Australia that does radiography to at least consider what we're doing. They're not bound to adopt it by any means. But I think the fact that 2 of the 3 universities in New South Wales are doing this trial is going to give weight to what we're trying to do. Anyway, as I said, this is the expanded transition table, and you'll notice across the top we've got Year 1, 2A, 2A, 2B, 2B, 2C, 3A, 3B, Year 4, Semester 1, Year 4, Semester 2. Now, I want you to bear this in mind when you're looking at how we propose to assess against it. Now, I am going to be using some educational literature in this to back up what we're saying. I believe that in the concept of evidence-based practice, and I'm thinking that you would too. So I want you to see that what we're doing is soundly based in the literature. And if you think it disagrees, again, please say something. Now, assessment of a student's clinical performance is observational assessment. Would you agree? We're observing our students in their performance, and we're making our expert decisions, and they are expert decisions, based on what we observe in our students' performance, right? Okay? Assessment of clinical performance during training ranges from informal observations of students in clinical settings to very formal and sometimes complex systems of data gathering from multiple raters about the performance of health professions students in actual clinical settings with real patients. Now, this is quite a deep statement because let me put it to you this way. If a student is doing an end of session exam at university, right? Let's just say, and we don't do it this way, but let's just say that exam was worth 100% of the subject, right? What the student gets as a grade for that subject is based on an isolated period of time, isn't it? It's based on what they write in the exam. Let's say then that the exam's worth 50% and they have 2 written assignments in the course of the session that are worth 25% each, for argument's sake. Then it's based not on one isolated period of time, but on 3, isn't it? It's based on the student's ability to translate that learning into those 2 written assignments and into that exam at the end of the semester. It's still an isolated set of assessments. Now let's translate that to the clinical or work integrated learning environment. You sit down with your student halfway through at the 3-week mark if it's a Sydney placement, at the 2-week mark if it's one of ours, and you fill out a bit of paper. And you think, okay, yeah, they did that, they did that, they did that. And then at the end of the semester, the end of the session rather, you do the same thing, only this time it's got a mark attached. All right? Again, although you might be basing that on what you've seen over the course of the placement, in general, it's pretty much what you're thinking at the time, isn't it? Realistically. So, what this statement is saying is that if we're going to do it properly, everything should be taken into account. Informal situations like, you might be having a busy day in your management role and you happen to be in the back of the office talking to your admin staff about something that's going on. And the student doesn't know you're there, but you hear the student come out into the waiting room to call a patient, and you hear their interaction with the patient. Is that an unrealistic scenario or is that real? It's real, isn't it? Okay. So, store it in your mind. Okay? That is something to do with that professionalism of that student. It's one piece of the jigsaw puzzle that you're putting together to build an overall idea of this student's performance. Okay? Making sense so far? But it's not just the informal observations, it's the very formal. So the very formal might be where you're assessing them doing a particularly complex examination. Let's say you're working in a large public hospital, say you're Mohammed in Liverpool. In Liverpool you get a lot of trauma through, don't you? Okay? Let's say you've got your patient who is severely injured in a major road trauma, and the student is interacting with that patient, all right? And you're assessing them on their clinical reasoning, their ability to work under pressure, their time management, the quality of their imaging, the way they relate to the other staff, the way they're fitting into the interdisciplinary team in the emergency room. All these things are coming into play in your assessment of the student. There's our formal and complex system of data gathering. Now, it says from multiple raters. Now, I'll bet that none of you spend all 4 weeks or all 6 weeks with the student. You're not shadowing them round like Mother Duck, are you? It's not how it works. You're all too busy to do that. You're dependent on your colleagues, on your staff, that you're entrusting the students to when you can't be with them. Am I right? Okay. And so you need the feedback from those staff, don't you? So this is where the multiple raters comes in. All right? Again, what I'm talking is building a big clinical picture, a jigsaw puzzle. All right? Everything you see from the moment that student walks in the door till the moment they leave with their final assessment in their hot little hand is part of the picture. And this is what we're trying to capture. Okay. Now, one of the most controversial things in assessment of students is how we actually record it. Now, when I first started at the University of Sydney back in 2007, we had a ABCDE system in about 4 categories. And to be quite honest, it didn't measure very much at all. So one of the first things I did when I started there was I thought there's got to be a better way of doing it. So I didn't have the research and the reading background into education that I do now when I started then. And so I thought, oh, what better way to do than look at everybody's and take the best of it and put it all together. So we developed the first version of the one that Sydney's using now, where you ranked each category from 1 to 10 and then wrote some comments about it, and there's 22 categories. So we tried that for a while, and what I found was that in a lot of cases, I was getting people just writing 7, 7, 7, 7, 7 down the side and not writing any comments. And the first thing that said to me was, people aren't thinking about this. There's absolutely no thought gone into it whatsoever. And we kept going with it for a while, and I continued to get persecuted in staff assessment meetings by people telling me, your students can't possibly be that good, there's too many HDs. To which my response was, well, aren't we trying to produce good practitioners? But anyway, that's another point. So I looked into other ways of doing it, and in speech pathology, they use what's called a VAS, a visual acuity, visual analogue scale. And that's what the Sydney assessment form has now, where it's a block where you draw a line somewhere along it, and you don't know what mark you're giving. The student doesn't know what mark they're getting. But we have a way of interpreting that into a mark. And the other thing we did was we randomly turned some of them around. And the reason we did that was A, to make people read it, and B, because I knew the same people who wrote 777 all the way down would put a ruler on it and draw a line straight down. So we had to do it to make it so that people would actually think about it and put some thought into it. And boy, didn't I cop some flack. But what I found was the people who actually thought about it and put effort into assessment actually liked it. And it was the people who didn't put thought into it who didn't like it. I know I got a really nice email from Janelle's predecessor at the SAN, Andrew Featherston, telling me he thought, this is great, this is really good, I really like it. And you know, I had a lot of respect for Andrew, and he really always put a lot of thought into what he did. And that's just an example. But I know that there's a lot of people don't like it, and as I've done more research and more reading, I've come to the conclusion that there is actually a better way. Now, one of the things that stops people doing it properly is you will know from the Sydney assessment that there is a rubric, there's a marking rubric, but it's not attached to the assessment form, it's separate. And it's really hard in your mind to correspond the form to the rubric. It's hard to match it up. So what we need to do is to be able to incorporate the rubric into the assessment form so that people know what they're looking at. Have I lost you yet? Am I making sense? Okay. Now, this research that I've been reading comes from, I have to admit, before I left the University of Sydney, I took Natalie round with me to a few clinical sites to meet people. And when we went to visit Janelle at the SAN, we walked into her office and there was this book sitting on the bench, and it was called Assessment in Health Professions Education by Downing. And I looked at it, and the first thing I did was grabbed a bit of paper and wrote it down, then went home and looked it up on Amazon and bought it. And thanks for having that book in your office, Janelle. It was really good. And Downing states that no more than 7 quality rating categories should be used on observational assessment instruments. And Williams, Clayman, and I probably will say this wrong, I'll call it Magagi, agree. 5 to 7 quality ratings are optimal. Additional quality rating categories add no performance information and just complicate the task for raters. So what we're looking at is a 7-point scale for measuring our students against the standards. So, taking the Year 1 standards, what we've done is we've got the categories down the side. Up the top, you'll see Year 1 expected standards. And next to it, we have from unacceptable through well below expected standard, below expected standard, at expected standard, above expected standard, well above expected standard, and exceptional. So what you've got is your elements from the rubric here and your 7-point scale next to it. And you're not allocating a number. Numbers tend to be somewhat meaningless. What you're doing is you're saying where you think that student sits in comparison to that standard. And how it changes from clinical block to clinical block is the standards change. They progress. So for each clinical block, you'll get a form that looks the same, but the standard that's sitting in there is different. It's progressed from the one before. What are you thinking? Any comments?
I think that's a great idea. We need more graduation. As they progress, we haven't got any room to learn.
Okay, don't forget to use the microphones. But
Customised.
yeah. So, and I believe that this will be simple for people to use. When we did the feedback, I got the feedback on the national survey, right? One of the things that people said was they wanted it to be simple. They don't want it to be complex. And I understand that, because the more complex an assessment is, the more time it takes you to do, and the more time it takes you to do it, then the less likely you are to put the effort into it that's required. And I'm not accusing you of being slack, I'm just being realistic. Am I right? Okay. And the more simple it is, the easier it's going to be to do it right. Shari.
Could you possibly swap those around as well? Instead of having unacceptable at the top and exceptional at the bottom, swap them around as well, because that person, same those around as well, and then you'll get
Look, that's possible. That's not a bad suggestion. I think possibly I might have tested people's patience to the limit with it before, and I don't want to cheese people off too much. But look, that is a very good suggestion. Thank you. I think that what we need is to just try and get people on board and get people to own the process. I think that's the most important thing in getting people to do it properly. And I think that's possibly why there was a fair bit of resistance to when we introduced the VAS with the Sydney assessment form, was that we just said to people, here it is, do it. And there wasn't really consultation with it, and I admit that. So this is why what I want to do is get all of you on board so that you can start telling people this is coming and this is going to be good. I really want you to start selling it to your colleagues as a good way of doing it, and people who aren't here. Now, another thing about this form is it can be done online. And what we've done is I've developed for every level a whole lot of PDFs, and they're interactive PDFs. So what that means is we can get it online. Now, at Charles Sturt, we're hoping to get our students up and running with iPads. I'm not sure whether it's going to be approved, but we're hoping to be able to get our students an iPad at the beginning of second year that they can take with them on clinical, and we can fill out the assessments on the iPad. I don't think, from talking to my colleagues at Sydney, that there's much possibility that that's going to happen there. Their funding's different to ours.
Don't bet on that. We've got a few potential possibilities.
Okay. Well, that'd be good. Jens, you?
Well, I developed something similar for Central Queensland, and it was all completely online. And it was all totally interactive as well. And everything was assessed, and I got the information immediately as the medical academic. And across the board, I had 100% success rate. Like, everyone that was involved was happy to use the computers. They didn't have to have an iPad. I think that would have been 10 times better. But the involvement from the clinical practitioners was sensational.
Thank you, Jens. That's really good to know. And I think if we sell it the right way to our clinical centres, that they'll actually like doing it online instead of doing it, doing it on paper. Tiffany, you were going to say?
I think it protects the integrity of the data if you're doing it online, and you can
Yeah.
use it both as a tool with the student to discuss the feedback, but then to feel like you can send it a little bit confidentially.
Yeah.
Say if you had a few unacceptable levels, might not be comfortable ticking that, and that might be why you get so many just satisfactory responses.
Yeah. And look, I understand that. And I think, to be fair, one of the areas that I've been reading about is why people don't fail students who should fail. And I think, and I've got another presentation that's got literature from nursing, from medicine, from social work, even from teaching, from education, that talks about why people don't want to fail students. And one of the biggest ones is that in medical professions, we're all nice people and we don't like doing it. We enter medical professions because we're caring people. Rob, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the previous point about the digital side of things. One other actual benefit, we've just been hit very strongly over the head by our confidentiality. So we're now not allowed to send out entire workbooks. So we're only able to send out the information for that current clinical placement. So one of the other advantages with an electronic side of things is the student can have access to the entire workbook. They can show you, but that if they want to, but they also don't have to. You can only just see the current one and to be able to fill in that. So there's those sorts of issues that we're now having to address on the confidentiality side of things, and so this electronic side of things that I'm actually going to get you and Jens to work together a little bit if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Happy to do that.
And it's addressing those sorts of issues as well as the timely things and all of those sorts of things and making it easier for everyone to fill in the forms. So I think we've got some steps we can go forward.
Yep, absolutely. Shirley?
I've been doing clinical assessments for Newcastle University. They were online, and the entire process was online. And then as I submitted it, it was submitted back to the student, and then the student's response, and then it came straight back to me. And that was a beneficial way of doing the assessment. And then we could sit down and do reflection on the whole process before they left.
Yep.
Instead of doing it and having no interaction afterwards.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
It's very good.
Okay.
So Andrew,
Janelle, yeah.
okay, so we can print off these to spread around the rest of the mentors in the department that they can fill out as well, or is it this just for the primary assessor?
Okay. I'm open to people's ideas on this. That's a very good point. What I would like to see happen is that the mentors each fill it out, but the person who's responsible collates it and gives us a final result. I think that's probably the fairest way of doing it, and some departments do that. Antonia?
Yeah, I've been using, because it's me doing it for radiology, I've been using it for clinics as well. But I've also used the online feedback for assessment results when I give them the Oscar, because I believe students should get feedback rather than just a pass-fail, etc. And I give feedback for each question, but they're not supposed to have the mark. So they can actually take the feedback column out and give the student the feedback, which I think is useful as well. But I find I make my students have their own assessment sheet, so that's kept in the clinic that they can look at. But I fill in the clinical assessment on the iPad each time and send it into the assessment office.
Yeah, that's where we're heading. Thank you. Mohammed?
Yes, looking into the hindsight, the students when they come for assessment or for the placement in our place or any other centres, it's very handy to look at the books currently to see what marks and what comments they have had from previous places. And that can give not only pros and the cons, but also some of the centres can give a student, I've got vivid examples, some of them will come with A's, 10s, 5 out of 5. Till the Liverpool Hospital where we do a lot of critic and evaluate them through a lot of upheavals. And when I did a assessment for a student in the mid-clinical, that particular student started crying, saying that we are very harsh. So when I tackled that particular student saying, do you want I's, 10s? I can give you. But do you think you're worth it? Do I think you're worth it? Because when we do assessment, we get feedback from other radiographers where they've been placed with. And I think the most important thing is to look at the whole booklet to what they've been through and nothing against the private practice. I've seen the students who come from private practice, they come with I's and 10s. And when they really come to the hospital system, they don't know basics of how to tackle the patients who are on the trolleys, on the bed, or trauma scenarios, or even a walking wounded with a cut finger. So I think electronic is fantastic, but the booklet should not be phased out very quickly until such time that we get access to the electronics for the previous ones also.
Well, Mohammed, I know where you're coming from, but as Rob just mentioned before, we're not allowed to do it. We can't give you their previous reports. We can't give you access to it for confidentiality reasons. We're just not allowed to do it. Rob, you were going to...
Mohammed, we thoroughly agree with you. We think you having that information is important, and to me it's part of the development of the student, and I personally think that should be a progressional approach, and you having that background information. Unfortunately, the confidentiality side of the university says you are not allowed to know what's happened. We're theoretically not meant to know what's happened in a previous subject, or potentially. No, well, it's slightly different as academics. We're allowed to see all of that, but when it comes to external information being sent out about the student, we've got very strong guidelines that we are not allowed to breach in terms of that. So unfortunately that's the direction that everybody is heading in terms of major things like this. Confidentiality, a whole lot of these sort of lines are now become a lot more rigorous, and we're not allowed to break them. But I do agree with your sentiment that it should be part of your ability to see how the student is progressing as well, because as far as I'm concerned, you're part of the clinical teaching team. But unfortunately, you're not an employee of the university, so we're not allowed to breach that.
Yep. So,
I just want to ask, are you just giving them 1 mark for the, or are you breaking down the marks? Because at Sydney, if we do it across all clinics, they get an assessment for technique, an assessment for knowledge, and there's also a personal professional development score.
Can I defer answering that?
Yeah.
Because the next part of the presentation, I think, will answer your question. Janelle, did you want to say something? And then after Janelle's comment, we'll move on.
Okay. This is very timely because I had a student recently that I was concerned about. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. She wasn't quite up to scratch or where I expected her to be. And I became fearful of, I might have to fail this student. And then I thought, well, if I fail this student, am I failing it because I'm not judging her accurately, or am I failing her because I'm accurate? So I like this system because it makes it more accurate in assessment. So if you do fail someone, it's because that information is there and you're mapping it back against that criteria and those elements and those standards. In terms of finding out what happened or why she's at the point she is, I went back to her and I said, can you tell me about your previous placements? And she told me her experience from her previous placements, which gave me the information I needed to go, right, now I know where you're at and now I can work with you on this.
Yeah.
So from that information, though, can you then go back and talk to the university in terms of that you can express your concern for that student?
You can certainly talk to us about your concerns, and we'll listen to what you say and give you as much guidance as we can without breaking the confidentiality of the student.
One of the other things I should have pointed out, if the student wants to tell you about what's gone on at any previous ones, that's them providing you that information. That's not us breaching their confidentiality to you. So that's different.
That's right. And the other use the university as support.
Yes. Absolutely.
And the other thing I want to stress is that as clinical educators, you do not fail the student. You provide us with information. We make that decision. I don't want anybody in this room to think you are failing the student. You are providing us with information about that student. We will put the big picture back together again, including the information. We will make that decision on whether if the student fails or passes. It's never on your head that you have failed the student. You're providing us with whether they're acceptable or not.
Yep.
We put that in context with other information. We then make that decision. So please never feel that you are failing a student.
Sorry, no, go on, Shari.
I've been going to say something since Mohammed spoke. With all due respect, Mohammed, if a student has come from a private practice with no trauma patients, no patients with a cut finger, etc., they're not going to know what to do in a situation where they've got a multi-trauma. So in regards to assessing them, it's not only just a block by block, it's actually, you have to think back of where they were prior to. Because in private practice, we've got mainly ambulant patients. They're normally, the majority walk in, walk out, hopefully. after their procedures, etc. So you then have to take into consideration where they were previously, which then goes back to you saying that we really do need that information, which you can't provide. So it's sort of a catch-22 then, isn't it, in that respect?
Yeah.
You have to speak to the student, obviously, to ensure, that you know where they went and where they were, so that then you can assess them not just on whether they were private practice before and had no trauma, but on specifically where they are now.
And this is where, remember this morning I was talking about the role of professional judgment. And if you have a student for a 2B placement in your private practice, and Mohammed has a student on 2B in his large public hospital, then your professional judgment of what you'd expect a 2B student to do in a private practice will be taken into account, and his judgment of what he'd expect a 2B student to be able to do in a trauma centre would also be taken into account. Does that make sense?
Just last comment. Don't take me wrong there. I don't judge the students like they cannot do a trauma. When they come in, we judge them, especially for the first years, on how they can do on a working patient. And the point I was trying to drive at is the marks. Because when I go and sit down with the mid-clinical, one student, few of them actually start shedding tears. Like, I've got all 10s and A's. And I told them, do you want marks or do you want to achieve something here? This is how I tackle my students.
Thank you. Thank you. That's exactly what I'm thinking.
And just last week, before I came here, there was I had about 3 from Newcastle University students. Mixed bags of experience, like mature students and one young boy. I based on this feelings, and they looked at me and said, marks is not everything. And they told me that they had good marks coming here, but they didn't know how to do a simple chest X-ray on the bed. So what we should emphasize there is, marks is not everything. You do what experience will give you the mark at the end.
Yep.
That's number one thing. And secondly, what I do is assess them and find out during the first days their requirements, objectives. Put on the strategies. Have them met that objectives? And if they haven't, I fail as a supervisor, I fail in my duty to identify and rectify with them. And this is the first week that we have to do, because taking back to the private practice and smaller hospitals. So we have to actually make sure that they come up with those things and sit down with them, put them into the place where they need more experience, and then every day or every second day, I do the same thing. I do talk to them, and I talk to my colleagues. And believe me, there was a student who had no idea how to do a trolley case, chest X-rays. He's now going with confidence within the 2 weeks' time.
Yep.
So I think what we plan out there is very, very important. So mark again is not important. What they can achieve out of you and me out there. That is the finality of it.
Yep. Okay. Thank you all for your contributions to that discussion. I think it's really important that we realise that our workplaces are different, and that's where our professional judgment comes in applying the standards. Now, I want to move on, and the reason I want to move on from this is because I want you to understand how this will fit in to the overall scheme of assessing the student on placement, because this is only part of it, all right? There's, to quote a famous ad, but wait, there's more. Now, let's look at a little bit more literature. Assessment is the making of judgments about how students' work meets appropriate standards. Assessment of student achievements is judged against consistent national and international standards, and we've looked at this morning, so it's a bit of a recap of what we did this morning. In addition to knowing about standards, students need to compare their actual levels of performance with these standards, okay? And teachers must be prepared based on judgments about quality, not based on wanting to reward effort or improvement, right? So that's a bit of a recap of where we were this morning. So what we want to do is do an application of standards-based assessment. The performance of the student is measured against the standard expected in each of the 6 categories. Now, we've already looked at those categories. We've already seen how the standards from the different levels apply. All right? Now, we've already seen how it moves from level to level. Now, again, these authors state the importance of keeping it short, okay? Making it harder isn't a good idea. But now we move into another part called global assessment. Now, these authors state that a global item should also be included in the assessment form. Now, do you remember in the original transition table that I showed you, it had a general description of attainment as the first criterion? Do you remember seeing that? Okay. In the expanded transition table that I developed, that wasn't at the top. We've put it at the bottom. So we've expanded them, and this is going to be our general description of attainment, or our global item at each placement block. So it's like a summary of the student's performance. So how do we assess against that? I don't believe you can put a tick against these. So at the end of it, we just get you to write about it. This is your chance to write some extensive comments on how you feel the student is matching up with where the standards say they should be, where your judgment says they are in relation to the standards. So for example, for a first year placement, our expectation is that they're capable of interacting in the workplace in a professional manner, and that they demonstrate limited clinical skills under close supervision. So your first year might be able to do a simple chest x-ray with you sort of saying, do this, do that, do something else. And they're going to turn up on time, clean, in a neatly ironed uniform, not be pulling their phone out and going on Facebook during clinical, and not picking their nose in front of patients, basically. Okay? You get the idea what I'm saying? That's the level of expectation we have of a first year. So we want you just to write a couple of sentences on how you think the student measures up with that broad, overall, global idea of their performance. Okay? Now, the next thing is the alignment of university standards and professional accreditation body standards. Now, we can't just sit there in our offices and decide, okay, the standard's going to be this, this, this and this. There's people out there who have a say in our profession and a say in the university structure and a say in the way we assess things, and we have to align what we do with those standards, all right? It has to be done that way. And if you remember this morning, that very busy coloured flowchart I put up, it was an attempt to illustrate that. So a lot of work had already been done at Charles Sturt before I started there on mapping the standards to either the AIR competency-based assessment, or for the Nuke Med students, the ANZ SNM competency-based standards. So what we wanted to do was have a way of the students reflecting on how they measured up against those standards, and of us being able to map their progress against them. So how do we do that? Okay. In order to track a student's progress in meeting these standards, we need a longitudinal documentation, something that we can use to track them through the course. So the question is how we do it. And the answer, I believe, is this: the e-portfolio. Okay? So I won't read that quote, you're able to read. But basically what we're saying is the student reflects on on how they're meeting these standards, and they write about it in an e-portfolio which they submit to us, and we are able to track their progress against the standards. So what I started doing with our students on the 2A and 3A placements that finished recently is told them that they were to keep an e-portfolio, and every week of clinical, they were to write each of the 5 headings that I'm going to show you in a minute, and they were to reflect in just a paragraph or something like that on how they felt they'd performed against those standards, what learning experiences they'd had on clinical that they could measure against those standards. And I invited them to submit it on PebblePad every week, and as they submitted them, I'd sit down on Monday morning and go through what they'd done and give them all feedback on what they'd done via PebblePad. Now, if you don't know what PebblePad is, it's simply an electronic platform, an online platform for building a portfolio. And all our students have access to it, and Sydney also has access to it, I believe. So, now, don't bear this in mind as a final model. I'm showing you the progress of how this model was developed. The first model we came up with, the rectangular boxes on the left represent the assessments that we've just shown you, that you guys fill out on our students. Then, parallel with that is the reflective journal. Its progression being represented by the upwards arrow. And then the initial idea was to have at the end of 4th year a capstone assessment that was a combination of these. And as I said, there's more to it than this. This is just a start. So our reflective journal using PebblePad, each clinical block, students write reflections under the following categories. And these are the categories that they keep their journal on. Communications and interactions, professional judgment, profession competence and work readiness, professionalism and citizenship, and information literacy. And you might think it's a little hard for students to write about these things. In the announcement I gave the students that they were able, that explained to them what was needed doing, there's examples under each of them of what it means. So we've given them by example the type of thing that they can write about. Now, a lot of the students found it quite hard, but as they got into it, some of them did an absolutely cracking job. Some of the stuff that they wrote just really showed an extraordinary level of maturity. Some of it was dodgy. But I mean, what we have to do is allow the dodgy ones an opportunity to catch up. And the way to do it is to show them some anonymous examples of good work so that it gives them an idea of how to write. Okay? Well, let's move on from that. Portfolios are best used as part of a comprehensive assessment system that can triangulate on learner competence. Okay? So basically what we're saying is you can't judge everything on a portfolio. It's part of the jigsaw puzzle. It's part of the big picture. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term assessment for learning as opposed to assessment of learning. Okay? If you think about it, assessment of learning is like a multiple choice exam at the end. It's testing what the parrot's able to reiterate. A portfolio is assessment as learning or assessment for learning. They're assessed on it, but the process of building the portfolio is a learning experience in itself. Okay? Now, there's a lot of skeptics out there about the whole reflective learning thing, but if you're a skeptic, I hate to tell you, but it's very much based in evidence. There's a lot of research showing that reflective practitioners are the best practitioners. It is the way of the future, whether we like it or not. But the problem with reflection is you have to guide the students in how to do it. Now, that's not really a problem because we can do that. But if you just give the students a task and say, write a reflective journal, tell me about your day, you'll get, I went down to the coffee shop at morning tea and had a sausage roll and I spilt tomato sauce on my shirt. I mean, that's the type of thing that people are going to write unless you give them direction on what they're meant to write. So, you know, you might have enjoyed the sausage roll and it might have been embarrassing having the sauce on your shirt, but that's not part of your learning. It might be learning about how to eat a sausage roll, but it's not learning how to be a radiographer, how to be competent. Okay? So this is why we're using those 5 headings to guide them in writing their reflections. Now, this is, for some reason, my PowerPoint keeps moving some headings in. I don't know why it does it, but anyway, the writing's there. These are the examples we gave the students under each of the categories, and I don't expect you to read all of that now. This is on the website, which you're all going to go home and play with, I hope. And you'll see that you'll be able to read this and see that these were examples. Now, maybe I didn't explain this well enough to the students, because when I was out visiting the students on the placement, there was a 3rd year and he was actually at Jens's site, and he said he